launch of zombie psychology, implicit bias theory, and the implicit association test, the fourth of four of our shifting sands reports. There's a lot of us here, so I'm going to try to do the introduction as quickly as possible. Hi, I'm David Randall, Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars, moderator, and also one of the three co-authors. My two co-authors are Stanley Young, the CEO of CG Stat and director of the Shifting Sands Project, all these reports, and then also Warren Kinzierski, adjunct professor of environmental health at the University of Alberta School of Public Health. And again, co-author for everything. I'm delighted to have three panelists who are in alphabetical order. Hal Arkes, Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Ohio State University and researcher in the domain of judgment and decision-making with emphasis on economic, legal, and medical decision-making. Lee Jussim, a social psychologist and distinguished professor at Rutgers, New Brunswick's Psychology Department, and Amy Wax, professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and accomplished author and legal scholar. Delighted to have you all here. Let me say how this is going to be done. First, presentation by Stan and Warren on the technical aspects, the actual report itself, the technical bits of studying implicit bias psychology and doing statistical analyses of them. I will very briefly talk about some of the political legal implications, though fairly briefly, because Amy Wax will be discussing that in her comment. You then have comments in order by, I believe it'll be Lee Jussim, then Hal Arkes, then Amy Wax on different aspects, both on the psychology and on the law. I will say briefly also, after that, it's Q&A. People should put in their comments into the chat and Q&A buttons. I will convey them to people. Don't worry if there isn't time to pass on your comments. Send anything which hasn't been answered to me at randall@nas.org. And then I will pass on your questions afterwards to the panelists. So nothing gets lost. Also, if you got to run, don't worry about it. This is going to be recorded. It'll be on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel in perpetuity, and that should be happening within 24 hours. Link should be sent out, I think, to people who are registered. But just go to National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. So you'll always be able to get a chance to see this. Tell your friends. I just want briefly to give some of the background. The Shifting Sands Project has been studying the effect of the irreproducibility crisis on government policy. We have had 4 substantive reports studying the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and now this is generally widespread state and local government and private enterprise, more than the federal government for implicit bias theory. It's been using a particular statistical approach to test bodies of literature for irreproducible results. And the background is that there has been this massive irreproducibility crisis in science and social science. Groupthink, errors in statistical thinking, the culture in science that prizes positive results over true results. It's been increasingly realized by scientists and social scientists for a generation and more that really, in many disciplines, particularly those that use statistics, quite possibly, even probably, a majority of the results are wrong. Certainly not proven until reproduced. And this massive crisis, we are trying to trace out what have been the actual effects on government policy. Okay, 2:05, longer than I want to do. Stan and Warren, would you please be so kind as to start talking about the report itself?
Okay. So Chance, you're going to share the screen for the slides?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and so I won't, David has already given the introduction of what we focused on, zombie psychology. We looked at the analytical aspects of the implicit association test. Next slide. So what you're supposed to be looking at there is the state of science today. That used to be a functioning floating solar farm until some waves came along and destroyed it. And by analogy, that's really what's happened to science over the last couple of decades. So in fact, today, just to elaborate what David had said, is that bad science today has crowded out good science in the literature. Most research claims are actually false. And our analysis here was to look at the types of research claims related to implicit bias. Next slide, please. So our technical studies. So we're going to talk just a bit about what we presented. So we present a lot more in the report, which you can access. We looked at the implicit association test that used in two published meta-analyses. Now, we use simple p-value plots to independently evaluate claims of racial bias and then sex bias in high-ability careers. P-value plots, they allow us to judge whether a claim is valid or in fact irreproducible. Next slide, please. So if you look at the image on the left, shows this pyramid, and at the top of it sits the methodology of meta-analysis. So it's highly regarded in the medical sciences, and including the social sciences also. If we look at the image on the right, what it involves is researchers going into the literature, identifying individual studies that all address the same research question. Could be some aspect of use of the implicit association test, and if its results are related to some observed aspect of bias. These studies are identified, screened, and a much smaller number of them are eventually used for the meta-analysis statistical analysis. Next slide, please. P-value plots, what are they? Well, what we're doing is we're taking the test statistics from the meta-analysis studies, and these are actually correlation coefficients, which are trying to relate or correlate two variables, the implicit association test result and some observed measure of bias that's captured in the study. We convert them to p-values. We rank them from the smallest to the largest p-values and present them in a plot. These are the types of results that we're looking for that would that we could say we have been able to reproduce or we cannot reproduce the evidence of a claim in a meta-analysis. On the left side, what we're showing there is these p-values, when plotted, they align in a near 45-degree angle. And that is evidence of a null association, that is to say, no association. Whereas on the right-hand side, that is evidence for a real association between two variables. Most of those p-values are actually quite small, and they are aligned in a horizontal fashion. So as you proceed in looking at some of the slides that Stan is going to present, just keep in mind these expected behaviors. Stan, that's all I have to say. If you could take it from here.
Okay. We're testing a research claim of the IAT, which supposedly measures implicit bias with either explicit or implicit or real world observed thing. We look at correlations. If you look on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see p-values going up at about a 45 degree for most of the objects. And so that's saying there's really no correlation whatsoever between the IAT, implicit bias, and real world bias. And then down in the lower left-hand corner, you see some small p-values, which might indicate that there is an effect. But look at the dots themselves. If a dot is round, it's a positive correlation. If a dot is pointy down, it's a negative correlation. So based on the theory from psychology, there should be no negative correlations whatsoever. If you look at the little pointy guys going down through the graph, you see them going down even below 0.05, the typical place where you would judge it was a real effect. The net effect of this is that there's, and you'll see this in the report, there's essentially no correlation between the IAT, explicit bias, and real world bias. So there's no statistical support for the claim being made on implicit bias. Go to the next slide. This is gender in high intellect occupations, and the p-values are all way above 0.05, meaning for the 27 studies that we looked at, there's no effect, no indication of an effect of a gender effect. You go to the next slide. Here we're looking at, we got creative here, not finding that implicit bias is effective in predicting these phenomena. We said, well, what is? And here we looked at vocational preference for men and women. We looked at 11 vocations, and what we found is that all of these vocational preferences, both for men and for women, were highly statistically significant, meaning men prefer certain kinds of jobs and women prefer other kinds of jobs. That doesn't mean that there aren't men that switch and women that switch, but the overall impression is enormously strong that there are vocational preferences for vocations. And vocational preferences should have been used by the statisticians looking at this data to predict why there are differences in men and women in different professions. They used implicit bias, but they left out an incredibly important variable, vocational preference. Next slide. I'm a mathematician. Lots of men are mathematicians. There are some really good female mathematicians too. But the difference in performance on the College Board, the SAT, is about 40 points. Well, 40 points is 0.4 standard deviations, and if you're into statistics or anything, there's a whopping difference. You can see the male scores over time, and you can see the female scores over time. Now, I've been in enough math classes with really, really bright women that I have no problem with bright women in math, but the overall effect is just enormous. And if you're into STEM things, in my upper level classes, there were very few women. They, as an average, don't do as well as men in math, and math is often critical for those professions. And then if we look back at the Sioux result that we had in the previous slide, women, by and large, do not prefer going into kinds of professions. So, but the crucial thing here from a statistical point of view is what I've just shown you on preference and ability, math ability, is well known. The psychologists know this backwards and forwards. So it borders on statistical criminality not to insert these variables into the studies that were pro-offered in support of implicit bias. Go to the next slide if there is one. Yeah, we've come to believe, and many people now believe, that bad science has crowded out good science, certainly in the implicit bias area and in many areas. If you're doing bad science, it's a heck of a lot easier to get a published paper than if you're doing really good science. If you're doing really good science, you're very busy and it's hard work. You don't have time to deal with bad science. But if you're using bad technology, bad statistics, things like that, it's relatively easy to get papers published. When we look at data, we see these curves, these p-value plots, and again, what we expect to see is either a 45-degree line or a flat line with the p-values less than 0.05. When we see bilinear lines, then there's some p-values that indicate there's effect, but then usually there are a massive number of p-values indicating that there's no effect. And that's what we tend to see all over the place, is that they're massive claims, often selectively picking off small p-values, but when you look at the body of data, there's a massive amount of p-values that indicate that nothing's going on. I will stop there, but I am going to be available during the whole time and happy to answer questions as we go along.
All right, thank you so much. That's the professional aspects of it. I'm just going to speak briefly on the legal stuff. All implicit bias has been pushed into policy. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission uses it to pressure companies to change policies. All sorts of private companies decide they will use implicit bias as a way to satisfy requirements for, equity, etc. And it is being pushed into, implicit bias trainings are being put into state law already. I mean, it's just popping up all over the nation, more and more professions. The most alarming part is not on the whole yet law, but it's, in effect, the next frontier to change the legal system itself so that it relies on, in the operation of juries, of judges, on disparate impact, on implicit bias theory, on collective judgments and presumptions of bias based upon an ineffective theory of bias, rather than individual determinations of volition, judgment, will, which is what the legal system is based upon. It is, I think, a very terrifying prospect that's being pushed forward. But I don't want to say more about that now because I think Amy will in time say a lot more about it. So I'm going to say, Lee, would you be so kind enough to give us the first comment?
Absolutely. Can you hold? Can you hear me? Somebody's mowing the lawn right outside my house here. Is that coming through?
I can hear you, and I can't hear no lawnmower.
Okay, that's good. All right, I'm just going to share my screen and start the presentation. There we go. Can you see the title slide?
Yes.
Okay, now I'm in presentation mode. Can you see that also?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So as you can tell from the title, my point is that all the dysfunctions involving, or nearly all the dysfunctions involving implicit bias could have been prevented or avoided had the field simply followed conventional scientific standards. But to understand that argument, you need to know what I mean by conventional scientific standards. So it's very, in some sense, conventional in psychology to treat anything published in a peer-reviewed journal as establishing a new fact, to treat any report at p less than 0.05 as establishing a fact, to treat authors' interpretations of their findings as scientific facts, to treat small n studies as establishing scientific facts. They meet the first three standards. To treat studies with no known replications as establishing scientific facts, to ignore studies and critiques inconsistent with one's preferred conclusion, interpretation, or narrative, and to define constructs one way operationalize them differently, then treat the operationalization as if it manifests the defined construct, which then permits the researcher to make claims regarding the construct through this sort of process of subterranean importation, even though they're not addressed by the operationalization. So in some sense, these are the actual descriptive conventions within my field, but that's not what I mean when I say following conventional scientific standards. What I mean are the conventional standards of a high-functioning, rigorous science, which are going to be really obvious. Like, there's nobody here, and nobody, I don't know about nobody, some people disagree with everything. I suspect most people in my field would agree with most of these, even though relatively few of them act like they agree with them. Okay, so one is the Mertonian norm of organized skepticism. Nothing is treated as a fact for years because it takes many years for the community, both scholars and lay people, to skeptically vet and evaluate claims of some sort of new discovery. It takes a long time for replications to be published, if ever, or attempted replications. Then you have critiques that say, well, no, this doesn't mean what you think it means. And it just takes years for that to be resolved. In a functioning science, new studies, almost always, there may be rare exceptions, but generally should be treated as suggestive, not conclusive, pending additional research by independent teams confirming the findings and the interpretation. Authors' interpretations should almost never be accepted until years of skeptical vetting, because the study might even be replicable. Lord knows, like race IAT results are massively replicable. I do IAT studies. I get the same race IAT effect as anybody else. That doesn't mean that they mean what the advocates say they mean, okay, which I'll get into in a minute. Small N studies should be treated as trivial until replicated by, again, independent researchers with larger scale studies. Contradictory findings should be acknowledged and grappled with. And of course, the operationalizations need to match the definitions. But again, this is like a moderately well-informed 8th grader would get this. Okay. So how do you know when a field has actually made a new discovery and established something as a scientific fact? So I love this definition by the late evolutionary biologist, Stephen Jay Gould, which gives context and a sense of, well, when does, if not everything produced in scientific articles can be believed, well, when can it be believed? So I'm going to read this, even though, like, I know it's sort of annoying to read something that's already there, but it's just so good. In science, fact can only mean confirmed to such a degree that it would be perverse to withhold provisional assent. So let me unpack that backwards. Provisional assent refers to the idea that, in principle, approaching all scientific claims, it may not be literally all, but it's very close, are potentially subject to revision. Even if there is tons of evidence seeming to support it, if tons of new evidence comes in saying, no, we got this wrong, and here's the evidence that we got this wrong, and here's a ton of evidence, the original claim should be subject to revision. That's what provisional assent means. The first part, confirmed to such a degree that it would be perverse to withhold provisional assent, is that in the presence of a logical and coherent argument, passing skeptical vetting, passing severe tests, and a mountain of evidence, you can believe whatever the hell you want to believe, but it becomes perverse to disbelieve the science when there is so much evidence saying that something's actually true. So that's what this means. Not quite 10 years ago, we added this corollary, which I think also helps put in context not just implicit bias work, a lot of the work in psychology. Anything not so well established that it would not be perverse to withhold provisional assent is not an established scientific fact. So you can have 3 studies published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology and 4 papers in Nature and Science. And it's like, okay, you're beginning to accumulate some interesting evidence there, but pending attempted replications pending scientific critique, rigorous scientific critique, it's not perverse. It may not be perverse to withhold provisional assent because it takes a lot to clarify or to justify withholding. It takes a lot to justify believing that it is perverse to withhold the provisional assent, and that can't be done on the basis of a handful of papers. Okay, now we can get to implicit bias. That's the sort of general scientific context. Okay, so first, how is implicit bias defined in the literature? It's just a royal mess. It's just a royal mess. It really is a royal mess. Often it's not defined. Like, there are tons of articles that just use the IAT and interpret whatever emerges as implicit bias. So implicitly, they're acting as if implicit bias is whatever is measured by the IAT, which is just a measurement. So there's no definition. So, again, what do we do with that? I don't really know. Here are some actual definitions. And what you'll note is they're almost completely disconnected from each other. Cultural of implicit bias. Cultural stereotypes not consciously endorsed, association of concepts with groups, unconscious negative behavior towards a racial group. So you have stereotypes, you have behavior, you have concepts, you have culture, you don't have culture. It's like, what is this? It's just a conceptual mess. But my favorite, and how was at this conference, is in 2017, the National Science Foundation held a conference on the implicit bias and IAT controversies. Greenwald was there. He presented this definition as his sense of the working understanding of implicit bias used by most people for the prior 20 years. Introspectively unidentified or inaccurately identified effects of past experience that mediate discriminatory behavior. So let's unpack this. The IAT is the most common measure of implicit bias. It's a reaction time measure. It, in a sort of noisy way, tainted by measurement error and artifacts, but to some degree, it does assess how strongly two ideas or two concepts are associated in memory. That's not discrimination. The strength of association in someone's memory is in no universe discrimination, which requires behaving towards some other person. The IT does not assess that. What about mediation? Again, this would be obvious. I'm almost like embarrassed to present this because it's so obvious. It's certainly be obvious to anyone in my field. Mediation occurs when you have a causal chain shown here, like A causes B and B causes C. So in this situation, B is said to mediate the effect of A on C. To establish mediation requires three variables, A, B, and C. IAT is one variable. It can't possibly establish mediation by itself. It's completely impossible. No one could, it's an empirical question. Maybe the IAT scores mediate this or that or anything, but you can't define it as mediation. It's a single variable. It's completely absurd. It is completely absurd. Okay. How about introspectively or inaccurately identified? Well, we now know that this is just not true. I mean, the IAT research proceeded for almost 20 years before anyone bothered to even assess whether people knew or could predict their IAT scores. And when they did, people knew were able to predict their IAT scores exceedingly well. That correlation of 0.7 is one of the highest ever obtained in psychology. Okay, so when you go through all that, what's left is something like the effects of past experience on the connection of concepts in memory. But the bottom line is that the IT is not, but by this definition, the IT is not a measure of implicit bias. Now, maybe you can concoct some other definition. That's fine, I guess. But by the definition that Greenwald presented as the working definition used by most people doing work in this area, it's not a measure of implicit bias. Okay. So let's get back to the effects of past experience on association and memory. I kind of believe that. There's very good work. One, there's just common sense. We have lots of associations. I put a few gray ones up there that have a strong basis in reality. It's like, this is obvious, just the connection. The fact that concepts are related in memory is also just not a shred of evidence by itself for any kind of bias. I mean, I could do whatever, I have a ham and cheese bias, like, it's like ridiculous. It's completely, again, it's completely ridiculous. Okay, I'm getting myself excited. But the early cognition researchers in cognition had been studying implicit cognition starting in the 60s. And this 1989 paper, it was a review, sort of a stock-taking review at the time. And again, I'm just going to read the stuff in mostly in highlighted because it's just so rich. Implicit learning produces a tacit knowledge base that is abstract and representative of the structure of the environment. It can be used implicitly to solve problems and make accurate decisions about novel stimulus circumstances, which makes sense if these implicit knowledge and implicit beliefs are to some extent, perhaps imperfectly, they may not always be perfectly accurate. I don't want to overstate that, but to the extent that people pick up regularities in the environment, of course, their implicit knowledge will be accurate to at least some degree. Okay. That's just on the definition. It gets worse from there. Actually, I should maybe I moved my thing here. Forgot that I was like had my camera at the other place. Okay, so this is a short talk. I have like 70 backup slides. I can explain every one of these, but for now, I guess you need to take my word that there's evidence for all of this. The IT is computationally structured to exaggerate bias. If you reduce the measurement error to zero, this is one of the Blanton papers, there's two papers, you reduce it to zero, no matter whether there's trivial bias, or a trivial reaction time difference on the IAT, or a very large reaction time difference, either way, you get huge bias scores. You know, the current algorithm is a D score. I'm not going to go into that. D scores for the race IAT are in the mid, you know, like 0.4, 0.5, typically, something like that. If you reduce the error to zero, which makes it a perfect measure, and there's any bias at all, no matter how minimal, the D score is 2. This is bizarre behavior for a measure of even association between concepts and memory. But then, if you add measurement error to the IAT scores, which they did using Monte Carlo simulations, you can have a sample where almost no one has an association or is biased by their conventional terminology. And the IT will produce results, depending on the amount of random error, showing that 70% of the sample has an implicit bias. Okay. So, you know, given that Greenwald-Banaji are famous for touting between 70 and 90% of Americans have these sort of unconscious racism, implicit bias, the measurement error can produce these kind of effects, you might think is kind of damning, even though, as far as I can tell, none of the advocates have ever addressed this. It continues to get worse. There are a slew of studies, and again, I have these in my backup slides, showing that individual acts of discrimination generally tend to occur at very, very low levels. Just scores of studies at this point. Some of them are IAT studies, where they're looking at the predictive validity of the IAT for some form of discrimination, but overall, there's no discrimination in the study. Now, you can still get a correlation, right? I mean, if low IAT scores predict, say, pro-Black favoritism and high scores predict pro-white favoritism, you can have predictive validity of the IAT, but there's no net discrimination in the studies. The point is, the IAT is a measure at the individual level, the sort of connection of concepts and memory. And if acts of discrimination are generally occurring at very, very low levels, there's almost nothing for it to explain. I'll take a break before I continue. What did I do?
That was me, my bad.
Do I need to reshare? I think I probably,
Yes,
or is
yeah,
it, I need to can you see my blank screen or I need to reshare?
No, you need to reshare it.
Okay, all right. So, we got here. Let me go here. Here. No, I'm having a problem. So let me stop the share and retry again. Oh, I see what I did. How about now? Can you see a blank slide?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me, somehow the Zoom thing is now on the same, I'm working with two screens here. So let me get it off the screen here. Okay. So, this is a short talk. There's so many more the issues. I'll just briefly go through some of them here. I think Hal's going to talk about that. The IIT has low retest reliability. For a long time, and even continuing, there's this weird doubly computed effect size. The IIT's D-score is an effect size, and then they compute effect sizes off of the D-score as if it was a conventional variable, and that tends to inflate the effect size for the IIT. The literature routinely confuses correlations with racism. So if the IIT predicts discrimination, its conclusion is that this has something to do with racism. But there's at least one study, probably more than this, where there were two kinds of behavior: pro-Black favoritism and egalitarianism. So in that particular study, there was a non-zero correlation of the IIT with that behavior, but there was no conventional racism in that paper. Anyway, I focused on the IIT, but actually other measures of implicit bias typically perform worse. Changing IIT scores doesn't change intergroup behavior. There's now a bunch of studies showing that. One of the critiques described it as lacking credible evidence of construct validity. And of course, one of the big debates, I think Hal will probably talk about this too, is over the extent of the predictive validity of the IIT. But predictive validity is not a causal effect. It's a correlation. And it could represent a causal effect, but there are lots of other explanations for correlations, which are almost never addressed in IIT research, as far as I can tell. And this work, there's a sort of growing chorus of critics, which is an absolute change in my field, which have described IIT, sort of the implicit bias work, as delusive and as a degenerating line of research. Okay, so what are the scientific take-home messages here? Use of the term implicit bias has become sort of a rhetorical fad based on flabby evidence. The IIT is a measure of individual reaction times and at best association between concepts and memory. It's not a bias of any kind. If individual discrimination occurs at low levels, there's very little for the IIT to explain. And after almost 30 years at this point, implicit bias advocates have failed to produce strong scientific evidence justifying most of their main claims. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I will just say, the files on Open Science Foundation that Lee has put up, the literature, it is brilliant. We're indebted to it for our report. It's an academic accomplishment to have gathered that secondary literature, and it's really worth anybody's time who's interested in this subject or who just wants to read takedowns of a really hollow discipline. And I must say, and OSF is to be commended, Open Science Foundation, for hosting it and having it up there. I mean, that's actually part of the scientific process, is to put up this sort of scientific literature so that you can have a means to assess a scientific claim that affects public policy. So kudos to everyone there. Hal, if you'd be so kind.
Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm going to talk about some specific studies to show how things that normally do not support the IAT's predictability of any kind of bias can be reinterpreted in such a way that it appears to lend support. I do work in medical decision-making primarily. Here's one of my least favorite studies by Green, and you can see that 220 physicians were presented with a vignette. This particular male came in with hypertension, he'd been a smoker, and so on. Perhaps the physicians who were reading the vignette, the male described was either black and the other half white. Now, the question was whether the physician who read this scenario would recommend clot-busting medications, which was deemed in the vignette when it was created to be the best possible therapy for this particular individual. The physicians were also given the IAT to measure their implicit prejudice toward blacks. Here's what I expected the results to be. These are not the results. I thought if someone was really biased, that is, if they were on the right side of the x-axis, it would be more likely to give only the white person the best therapy and would be prejudiced against the black person, who would be lower in their likelihood of getting the best therapy. The people on the left side of the x-axis would be non-biased, so they would do the same thing irrespective of the race of the person who was the patient. This is what I expected. Here's what they got. Exactly the opposite. But nevertheless, they supported their hypothesis by saying, the quotes on the top, as physicians' pro-white implicit bias increased, so did their likelihood of treating white patients and not treating black patients. In other words, the opposite result, they deemed to be supportive. You can see that the dotted line, the black, goes down when the likelihood of getting the best therapy goes down as the IAT score goes up, and the probability of getting the white patient's thrombolytic therapy to occur goes up. So they deemed this pattern to be supportive, as well as the opposite pattern to be supportive. Now, anytime you have a hypothesis that is supported irrespective of the results, you don't have a very precise hypothesis. What you have is sort of a trick in which no matter what the results are, you can deem it to be supportive of your hypothesis. This is the type of stuff that I've seen in the IAT literature, but this isn't my favorite. Oh, here we go. This is my favorite. I have to explain what an ultimatum game is. It's an economic game that's very popular in the literature. $10 is given to player one. There's a second player, player two. Player one has the task of splitting the $10 between the two of them. If player two likes the split will occur and each of them gets the amount that was proposed by player one. So player one could take the $10 and say to player two, I'll give you 5 and I'll keep 5. Is that okay? And player two will say, sure, and they each leave with a $5 bill. However, if player one says, I'll keep 9 and give you 1, player two can say, well, I don't like that, and I'm not going to accept it. Then both players get absolutely nothing. So therefore, the ultimatum game refers to the fact that player one can give an ultimatum to player two. Now, in this case, player one was depicted as a black person or a white person. The image of the person was on the computer screen, and the only real participant was player two. Every player two played the ultimatum game several times, sometimes with a white player one, who was always the proposer, and sometimes a black player one, who was always the proposer. Here are the results. The overall proportion of splits that were accepted was almost identical whether player one was white or black. There was only a 1% difference. I was very surprised that was statistically significant. But some of the player twos were Asian, and some were white, and some were black. So if you just look at the white player twos, the proportions of splits that were accepted were 45% if it was a white player one, and 44% if it was a black player one. This was not statistically significant. So I thought this would be the end of the study, and would show not anything statistically significant or important. But I was wrong. I asked them for the raw data, and I found out that they excluded from these analyses those participants who exhibited no difference between their acceptance of the suggested offer by Blacks and whites. They were perfectly unprejudiced. So if you exclude the people who are non-prejudiced, the remaining people were only those persons who did show a difference between their acceptance of the suggested offer, depending on whether the person proposing was Black or white. Now, if you exclude the people who don't support your hypothesis, it's not a secret that the remainder will support your hypothesis, which is not the way science ought to work. So after I got the data from them, I reinserted the data of the people they excluded. And now the amount of money participants who were willing to accept from Blacks versus whites was less than 2 cents out of the $10 stake. Now it's hard to manifest much less prejudice than 2 cents out of a $10 stake. So I concluded, although the authors didn't, that there really wasn't much prejudice going on here. But that wasn't their last sin. Oh, these are the conclusions by the authors. These findings indicate the participants are willing to discriminate against Black proposers even at a cost to their own financial gain. Well, if you throw out the people who don't have that characteristic, the remainder will. The cost is less than 2/1000 of the $10 stake. That's not too much discrimination. You can do a regression equation and find out how much of the variance the IAT accounts for in the racial difference in the acceptance rates. And the IAT accounts for 4.8% of the variance of the 2/1000th of a dollar of difference. It's hard to find anything this trivial, but they managed to do it. But nevertheless, it supported their conclusion that these people were biased. We're not done. Would you expect the white player twos to respond more quickly or more slowly to propose offers made by Black versus white player ones? Remember, player one could be either Black or white. The authors measured the reaction time to accept or reject the proposed offer made by player number one. This is a quote. The authors wrote that participants were more sensitive to small changes in the offer amount when the offers came from Black proposers. So I took this to mean that the participants, these are player twos, had to more carefully consider the implications of the offered amount when the proposer was Black, because it says they were more sensitive to small changes. So these careful considerations would take time. So I expected longer reaction times would be expected if the proposer was Black. But the opposite result occurred. But they said that was consistent with their reasoning. I don't want you to ask me how they figured this out. I can't explain it, but that's what they said. Either result, I think, would have again been consistent with whatever they proposed. And as Lee advertised, I'm going to get to two more serious problems. My point of the talk so far is that a large amount of social psychological research is not replicable, and our first two speakers showed us why that's the case. But even when it doesn't replicate, the two studies I've shown you show that even contrary results can be misinterpreted in a way that gives false confirmation. You can set up the experiment so any result leads you to confirm it in a bogus type of way. These are the two serious problems that Lee mentioned. For those who aren't statistically fluent, a measurement instrument must have high reliability. The test results must be consistent. I was on a camping trip with a friend of mine who caught a large fish and he took it into the local town, Ely, Minnesota. He was on the front page of the local newspaper because the size of the fish was so large. But when he measured it, it was, let's say, 22 inches. But when the newspaper measured it, what if they said it was 14 inches? Or when my friend Eric's mom measured it, it was 87 inches. Well, that would be poor reliability. You have to have the same measurement if the rater number 1 does it as when rater number 2 does it. Or when person 1 is measured at one time and then person 1 is measured at a second time. One of the handbooks of measurement says that in order to be reliable, you have to have a range of a reliability around 0.7 to 0.8. The IAT has a reliability of around 0.5. So therefore, by definition, this is an unreliable measure. You can't have a reliable measure if a rubberized measuring stick is used. If the IAT can't give you consistent, reliable measures, it simply isn't appropriate for research. There's a second thing any measurement must have, and that's high validity. The definition is the agreement between a test score and the quality it's believed to measure. In other words, does the test measure what it's supposed to measure? The typical way to measure validity is take a look at the amount of variance the test accounts for in some to-be predicted event. So if I want to know if player Jones is likely to hit a home run, I might look at factors like the velocity of the bat, or maybe that accounts for 20% of the variance in whether or not a home run can be hit. And maybe the size of the ballpark would account for 10% of the variance. Oswald and colleagues did a meta-analysis of lots of studies, and the IAT accounted for about 2% of the variance in explaining some prejudicial behaviors. So that leaves a whopping 98% unaccounted for. So when you're trying to take a look at things like distance someone puts their chair from a Black person, or the speed with which one talks, and you're accounting for 2% of the variance, you don't have a very valid test. So therefore, it has negligible validity for explaining behavior. So if you don't have reliability and you don't have validity, there's just not much left. I think I'll stop there, and we'll move on to Professor Wax.
Thank you so much. I actually just wanted to interrupt briefly just to say something. I don't want people to think that one wants to beat up just on psychology. A point made a few years ago was that there's an awful lot of news about errors coming out in psychology, but also the point, and maybe it was one of the two of you who made this, that social psychologists actually have done more work to check on the irreproducibility crisis. And conceivably, actually, psychology is the best discipline because it's actually begun self-corrective measures earlier. So I just want to throw that out there for people to keep in mind. Lee is putting his thumb up. Yeah, okay. So kudos to the psychologists who are doing things right. Having said all that, Amy, love to hear from you.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this important topic of implicit bias, which is something I've been interested in and writing about for a while. And here I'm going to focus on the legal implications. So I have notes over here. So if I look over, that's what I'm looking at. The interest in unconscious bias, testing for implicit bias, addressing its supposed effects, I think, are a byproduct of the frustrations surrounding the slow pace of racial progress in past decades, despite Civil Rights Act legislation forbidding discrimination based on race, what is called the law in disparate treatment, which means treating someone badly because of race. And also, despite changes in attitudes and other evidence suggesting that overt, deliberate racial discrimination has significantly abated. Yet, in the face of these hopeful signs, racial gaps persist in educational achievement, employment, income, wealth, health, other indicia. Thus, I think there arose a theory of unconscious bias, that adverse outcomes for people of color result from inadvertent forms of discrimination, discriminatory conduct that is motivated by observations of race that people are not even aware of, that they deny, and that, as a corollary, defy correction through conscious efforts. Now, I have several times written, as I said, on the legal status of such allegations, and I want to highlight some of my observations and add a few more. And here I'm going to focus on race, although of course many of these points apply to gender and other protected characteristics. First, it's important to realize that there is an enormous amount of terminological and conceptual confusion surrounding unconscious forms of bias or discrimination. So it helps to begin, at least if we're going to focus on the legal confusion, with the words intent or intentional. Critics of unconscious or implicit bias theory often assert that the laws against group-based discrimination, the Constitutional Equal Protection Clause, the Civil Rights Act, only protect against bias that is intentional, by which they mean deliberate conscious knowing, and not bias that involves unconscious processes. Now, the problem here is that the word intent does not appear in either source of the law. The Constitution speaks of the guarantee of equal protection, a very vague and open-ended standard. The Civil Rights Act is more specific. It forbids actions or decisions, quote, based on or on the grounds of race, which clearly establishes a causal standard of liability. What do I mean by a causal standard? That somehow the fact of a person's race, the perception of it, enters into or motivated or affects the way that person is treated by someone else or some institution, that there's a distortive effect. Initially, the use of the word intent came into the law of discrimination to distinguish between so-called disparate treatment, discrimination that is causally based on or motivated by race, and what is termed disparate impact. That is, adverse outcomes that are the product of neutral non-race-based criteria that nonetheless end up disadvantaging minorities. The Supreme Court long ago held in a case called Washington v. Davis that only, quote, intentional discrimination, and by that they meant disparate treatment motivated by race, violates the Constitutional Equal Protection Clause, but disparate impacts, neutrals that merely produce disparate outcomes, are not actionable. In contrast, in Griggs v. Duke Power, the Supreme Court said that disparate outcomes from neutral rules, right, discrimination that was not intentional, quote unquote, could sometimes give rise to civil rights liability under Title VII, Title VI, etc. Two different standards. In neither instance did the court use the word intentional to address the distinction between conscious and unconscious disparate treatment, or explore whether unconscious bias exists, how it operates, or whether it's unlawful. So where does that leave us today? What is and should be the status of so-called unconscious disparate treatment in the law? In my 1990s article, Discrimination as Accident, I note the possibility that disparate treatment, behavior influenced by perceptions of race, could potentially happen consciously or unconsciously. In other words, there could be such a thing as unconscious disparate treatment or discrimination. It could exist. If a manager declines to hire a black person because he judged him negatively based on his race, then that is harmful regardless of whether the manager is aware or unaware of what influences his decision. That race influenced it. It's still disparate treatment, and it still has the same pernicious effect. So arguably, as a matter of textual interpretation and logic, such unconscious behavior could be viewed as coming within the bounds of a Civil Rights Act prohibitions, or, if you care to interpret it, the Equal Protection Clause. But having made this point, that's where the trouble starts. Regarding unconscious bias, unconscious disparate treatment, regarding it as potentially illegal, or even as a broader societal problem that needs to be addressed more generally, raises a host of questions that are pertinent to the practicalities of assigning legal liability and, above all, remediating it, which is what the Civil Rights Act is all about. And of course, we've been talking about some of these questions today. What is the evidence? that such unconscious motivations actually exist, that they actually influence people's actions? How does one prove that unconscious bias affects a particular decisions? How do we prove that it leads to an adverse outcome in a specific case? And even assuming that unconscious bias does exist and accounts for some negative outcomes, what evidence do we have that the implicit bias test measures it, correlates with it, detects it? We know the answer because we've listened to the presentation so far, little or none. And even if we have identified and proven a specific instance of unconscious bias, a very big if, there is the question of how we remedy that. Is imposing liability likely to reduce unconscious bias? Will it remediate the unconscious bias problem, as the law would put it? And how about the implicit bias diversity training that is all over the place, that employers, the government, social actors have adopted to supposedly reduce unconscious bias and discrimination? Where is the evidence it has the desired effect, and where is the proof? Many of these questions, by the way, are not unique to claims of unconscious bias, disparate treatment. It turns out we ask them about claims of discrimination generally. Demonstrating discriminatory treatment, whether conscious or unconscious, turns out to be very difficult. In most cases, at least it is difficult today. Why? It requires distinguishing between unlawful motives, conscious or unconscious use of race, and other legitimate factors as a cause of unfavorable outcomes or adverse treatment of protected groups. Under current law, which is reflected in the woke dogma we see everywhere, disparities are routinely assumed to reflect discrimination, bias. That is, they are routinely assumed to be unlawful. But in the legal context, alternative neutral explanations must supposedly be proven, or at least considered, by those accused of discrimination. For example, employers who make adverse decisions about a minority worker have to prove or disprove that it's biased, which means they have to adduce alternative explanations, which in a societal context are often just ignored. What would those neutral explanations be? There are lots, right? There are well-documented significant supply side factors, differences in qualifications, behavior, lifestyle between majority and minority groups that can account for large differences in group outcomes, treatment on the job, etc. So we really can't or shouldn't assume that discrimination, whether conscious or unconscious, is the source of all social disadvantage. And yet we have basically reached a point in our society where that is a very popular assumption, and that is not specific to claims of unconscious bias. But I would propose that unconscious bias allegations are even more of a problem than conscious bias allegations for a number of reasons. The first reason has to do with proving discrimination, and the second with fixing discrimination or remedying it. The classic understanding of discrimination looks to the phenomenon of the conscious bigot, someone who harbors animus against, say, blacks or women, and treats them less well in many contexts. That person presumably knows what he's doing. He acts deliberately. It is not inadvertent or accidental. He means to discriminate. Now, how can we prove that? It's assumed that this person will show his true colors. He will say things or take action that makes his bias clear. We will have smoking guns. Of course, that assumption is a relic. It is less and less the case today as such attitudes have become taboo. Even if a person is aware of his prejudices, he will take pains to hide them. So, what we have today is a situation where bigoted actions, even if deliberate, have to be proved by circumstantial means, right? Which necessarily entails, as I've already explained, eliminating other non-discriminatory explanations. And take my word for it, that is hard to do, right? So what that means is that although it may not have been true in the past, today conscious bias is generally as hard to prove as unconscious bias because both require comparing paces and controlling for alternatives. Now, what about remedies? It is when considering remedies that I think the differences between conscious and unconscious discrimination really come to the fore. When someone knowingly discriminates, deliberately discriminates, and is held liable, the consequences, monetary sanctions, orders to cease discriminating, backed up by law and legal sanctions, those people, those sanctions will presumably act as an incentive for the person who's discriminating to stop discriminating, to stop their unlawful behavior. When the behavior is knowing and deliberate, presumably that's something the wrongdoer can control. He can stop. He can fix what he's doing in response to sanctions, and he has an incentive to do so. But what if the discrimination is unconscious? Then the wrongdoer is not even aware that his decisions are tainted or influenced by, let's say, race or some other characteristic. So how does a penalty or a remedy even influence such a person? What can he or she do to rectify decision-making processes going forward that they're not even aware of? The short answer is they can't. The remedy is unlikely to be effective because the wrongdoer is not aware of what he or she is doing wrong and thus doesn't know how to go about calibrating any correction, right? She doesn't have the control that she would with intentional discrimination. She can't respond to the sanctions in any kind of precise way. For the law, a remedy is only legally legitimate if it reverses the illegal action or its harms. But here the remedy seems both ineffective, imprecise, and futile. In the same vein, there is little or no proof that other techniques and manipulations, anti-bias training, all of the DEI type programs and protocols, will work against unconscious bias either. Now, that doesn't mean that the alleged wrongdoer won't change her behavior in response to these interventions, but here's the rub. Those behavioral changes are unlikely to reverse actual bias. Rather, they will be efforts just to reduce disparities, to produce what we call equity by any means necessary, affirmative action, de facto quotas, which are as likely to overshoot as undershoot the mark of correcting actual discrimination. So focusing on unconscious bias hastens the slide to disparate impact as the test of bias. David Randall has already pointed this out, and to producing proportional representation as the remedy for everything. And that, of course, is an attitude that is already quite prevalent. An attitude that is not fair or just, and that is devastating to the meritocratic practices and standards that we have engaged in to our credit so far. Now, it's 3:09. I was going to talk about the claims of scientific expertise that have accompanied efforts to address supposed unconscious bias. I don't want to take up more time, but I do want to say a word or two about this. And here I am going to make reference to an essay I wrote on Justice Scalia's jurisprudence a few years back, where I noticed that the justice was particularly skeptical of invocations of expertise in the cases before him, and especially in the invocations in what you might call the human sciences, psychology, sociology, that sort of thing. It's not that Scalia didn't think there was no such thing as expertise. He just was deeply suspicious of the shoddy behavioral science and assertions of expertise, and he thought that they were a cover for partisan agenda and political preferences. And maybe the most salient example of that is in the big affirmative action case, the Grutter case in 2006, in which the court gave a green light to the limited use of race in university admissions. And there, Justice O'Connor, who wrote the majority opinion, said, well, the justices should defer to the educational experts because they have assured us that student diversity has pedagogical value and enhances learning. And of course, there were little or no actual studies that were cited to support that deference to the experts. I think one or two studies where people who had already been admitted to Harvard and Yale, when asked whether they thought their education was enhanced by affirmative action, said, yeah, sure it's been enhanced, right? Not very scientifically rigorous here. But Justice Scalia, in his dissent, scoffed at this idea. He said, there's no evidence for these assertions. Why do we believe these experts? We shouldn't defer to them. They don't know any better than, anyone else. Now, of course, this did not endear Justice Scalia to Justice O'Connor. So there are multiple other examples that I could cite in desegregation cases, in prison cases, etc., of experts solemnly assuring us that a certain theory or other should inform the law, and etc. But, once again, coming back to unconscious bias, we have a ton of experts assuring us that unconscious bias is real, it's pervasive, it's influential, it leads to rampant discrimination, disparities, and disadvantage, and they tell us that the implicit bias test is a reliable measure of it, that diversity training works, it reduces discriminatory behavior. As with Scalia's skepticism and examples, we've already heard a plethora of evidence that none of these assurances is reliable, and we should not defer. So, needless to say, great skepticism towards these assertions is in order. There's such a thing as expertise, but when it comes to the human behavior and the so-called human sciences, we should all be very wary. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. I'm going to go straight to looking at questions. I must say, Lee has actually answered some of the best questions, and I'm going to recite them anyway because I think that they're still actually worth getting out there for the public. Dave Peterson had is the IAT, the Implicit Association Test, the result of incompetence, or was this intentional? This is the knave or fool question, and I guess Lee, could you again give your answer for the public, and then other people if they could contribute answers too? Oh, and I think you're still muted.
I'm not finding where the hell is it?
Well, sorry, it's
there we
an
go.
answer.
Oh, yeah, there we go. Yeah. Right, okay. So, right, is it incompetence or intentional?
Intentional.
And my reaction was like, yeah, it's not so simple. The IAT, when it was first developed in 1998, or first published in 1998, it was plausible to view it as a reasonable way to get at associations in memory. Some of which could be involved in stereotypes and prejudice. That was not ridiculous. So what went wrong? Greenwald and Banaji right away went to, these extreme claims about 80–90% of Americans being racist because of their IIT scores, without lots of chance for them and others to understand what the IIT was really about. Then that sets the stage. Academia, what I wrote to Dave, academia is a conformity-inducing system. Greenwald and Banaji are prestigious scholars. So if you're some, youngish scholar who has doubts, maybe you run a study that doesn't find what they find, many will be terrified to go public with this because they know, Greenwald and Bernanke have established this. Why are your results so different than everybody else's? This paper's not publishable. And who wants to fight that fight when they could do something else? So you have that. You have academia is really very, very far left. Like, I think it's further left than Fox News nightmares about how far left academia is. Like the actual data. So I have a former student who now works at FIRE, did this for his dissertation, and he surveyed almost 2,000 academics nationwide. And 40%, they didn't identify as like Democrats or liberals. I mean, some did, but 40% identified as radicals, activists, Marxists, or socialists. The comparable number in the US is single digits, 6 or 8% or so, something like that. You have typically mid to high single digits, maybe very low double digits on the far left and the far right in the country. So this 40% thing is just wow. So why is that relevant? Well, the far left is obsessed with racism. We have good evidence for this. They kind of see racism where it doesn't exist and all this sort of stuff. And especially, though not exclusively, white liberals have this weird guilt shame thing. So as soon as you bring up racism, the critical faculties turn off and it's, oh yes, everything here must be true. So you just didn't get the skeptical vetting. It was sort of closed off. If you did an IAT paper that didn't find the right thing, it would go to Greenwald or Bernanke or one of their, postdocs or former students or acolytes, and it'd be very difficult to get it published. I mean, Hart Blanton, I was at some meeting and we were talking about this. He said getting this IAT critiques published was the hardest stuff he's ever gotten published in his life. So this would be this for him starting maybe 2008 going to 2010. So that's 10 years after the IAT was first revealed. So you put all this together, and it means just figuring all this out has been very, very slow. People have made wonderful careers doing IAT research. And they have, they're senior professors, high-paying jobs, prestigious institutions. It's really paid off. And why would they, in a million years, be responsive and open to people coming along and saying, not so fast?
Okay. I think that's a pause. Does anybody else want to speak to this?
Yes, I have a question since I have all the experts here. I want to look at the design of the test itself. Lee has said it's a timed reaction to pictures and so forth. But if you're designing a test and it is a reproducible result, then you can fool around with the pictures and the words until you get a positive result. And the thing that tips me off in this is that you can do it for race, you can do it for gender, you can do it for obesity, you can do it for all of these things. But in every case, the person designing the IAT, and put your letter in front of it that you want, has the opportunity to construct the test. So as Lee says, you'll get a positive result. This thing looks like well, I'll end there. It looks pretty bad to me.
Yeah, I think that probably goes too far. One of the disadvantages of this panel is we don't have an IAT advocate here, and to try to defend what they've done. But a typical race IAT, which is mostly what I've done, although we've done some others also. The concepts are very, you'll have concepts related to black and white people, and then you'll have concepts related to good and bad or smart and dumb or whatever the stereotype or prejudice might be. And, you'll use conventional white or black names. It's very easy to find lists of popular white and black names. And then you'll use things that are, if you're doing good, bad, or pleasant, unpleasant, if you're, as in the original, if you're using, vomit and corpses and, things like wasps, They're obviously unpleasant things. And if you're using good things, what was the original? Was like rainbows and butterflies. And it was like, these are completely reasonable operationalizations of good and bad or pleasant and unpleasant things. So it's probably, there is freedom to construct it, but most reasonably constructed IATs, I would say most IATs are constructed reasonably in this way. So I don't, there are many problems with it, but I don't think in this particular case, I don't think what's sometimes called researcher degrees of freedom to construct an IAT any way they like is playing much of a role.
Can I say something? I mean, I think the IAT as a way to measure associations and stereotyping, and I mean, I think stereotyping exists, it's not necessarily all bad, is perfectly legitimate. The trouble starts when you try to extrapolate that to real world behavior, and then you see that it doesn't extrapolate very well, but you don't accept that result. So people start doctoring with the data. I've been to many social science presentations and seminars at my university. I used to go to them a lot, and I have to say that they were overwhelmingly contaminated. Really, just in the research design, leaving out variables that are not politically correct, that you wouldn't want as an explanation. So, you'll do a big social science study on people's behavior and outcomes and different groups, and you'll leave out whether they're married or not. And my favorite question to ask, and I got to ask it constantly, is, well, what about if they're married? Is that one of the variables? Oh no, we don't think that's relevant. So that is the way in which, the whole field is being contaminated. One of the many ways in which the whole field is being contaminated by how questions are asked, how studies are designed. I am very mistrustful of social science in the current academic climate.
I have a related thing to what Professor Wax just said. I tried to get some collaborators to do the IAT, but only use faces of Black females, not males. And the reason I thought of this idea is that I saw in some IAT studies that they restricted the stimuli only to males. And I thought that this was a peculiar thing to do unless you had some hypothesis that maybe the findings wouldn't generalize as well to females. As it turned out, I never ran the study. I couldn't get the cooperation I needed in order to do it. But I wondered if that was one of the things like marriage, which could account for some of the results that was being purposely omitted from the studies.
Thank you. I want to just interrupt to go to a different question, which I want to just sort of build on. From Dave Porter, he was asking. It's a long question, which Lee also answered, but it touches on social psychology and psychology, and how does the reproducibility crisis apply to both? And I want to build on that because that actually gets onto how does the reproducibility crisis work? Is it just sort of this broad brush thing, or does it differ very much subdiscipline by subdiscipline? So my question would be, to the extent that one can talk about a coherent field of social psychology, does the irreproducibility crisis hit it worse than the rest of psychology?
Yes.
If so, why? If not, why? And then the follow-up is the rest of psychology any better off?
Yeah, there are data on this. The subfields of psychology were examined. There were a few subfields. Lee can correct me if he thinks I'm misstating it. Social psychology led the way in the fewest number of reproducible results. Cognitive psychology did significantly better. And I think it's because in cognitive psychology, the dependent variables are much, much more well-defined, and the measurement problems don't exist. If you're trying to look at things like memory, for example, you either remember it or you don't remember it. But when you're looking at things like prejudicial placement of your seat near another person, there can be a lot more serious problems on interpretation. Whereas the dependent variables in cognitive psychology, interpretation is really not an issue. And therefore, the subfield of cognitive psychology did a lot better in those indices than social psychology.
Well, I see Lee nodding. Does anybody else want to add to that? Okay, look, thank you. And in fact, so I ask that question, as I say, because I think it is important to get the sense that the irreproducibility crisis does differ subfield by subfield, and to address it properly as a whole. I'm emphasizing this because ultimately this is meant to build up towards as a whole. You don't just say, oh, we need to fix the irreproducibility crisis. You need to say, here's what you do in this subdiscipline. Here's what you do in this subdiscipline. That makes it slower. It frankly makes it more boring in terms of being a policy wonk for it. But if you want to be effective, I think that's what you need to do to make those granular knowledge and recommendations, subdiscipline by subdiscipline.
I wanted to add one thing to what I said, and that is the role of ideology.
Yeah.
I think in social psychology, people who want to do the good thing and eliminate prejudice from the world have a motivation to interpret results in a way that's congruent with their ideology. In cognitive psychology, I think ideology plays a much smaller role. If you're doing research in memory or problem solving or judgment or decision making and the topics are economic, for example, ideology just doesn't play a strong role in those areas.
Thank you. We're getting close to 3:30, and we normally have people give closing comments. So I'm going to ask if people can do this well in reverse order, I think. Just, closing comments, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, things we should take away from this. Amy, may I ask if you would go first?
Okay, well, it's very hard for me to sort of encapsulate what I think the takeaway from this is. I guess I would have sort of a broad brush takeaway, which is that academia is really going through a crisis of corruption right now that is quite profound, quite widespread. I have had a front row seat to this in the way that Penn has treated me, that the shocking lack of intellectual integrity. Really, that is the only way I can put it. In the accusations, the procedures, the way that the complaints against me have been dealt with, it's really very, very discouraging. And I have lost my trust in higher ed as a result. That's the first thing. That's sort of the big picture. The second is that I think there is profound corruption in the law of civil rights and discrimination. We have lost our bearings. We have strayed from the actual purpose and text of many of the laws that were enacted in a way that is very intrusive, that blinks reality, that has corrupted and I think weakened our society and poses real dangers to our way of life, its integrity, our prosperity, our future. And we are reaping the whirlwind of that. And nobody, in power is doing anything to stop it. They're just hastening it, frankly. They're just accelerating it. It's a very partisan thing for me to say, but I'll say it. The Democrats are doing nothing to abate these trends. They are full steam ahead. So that to me is very, very disconcerting.
Thank you. Hal, if you would be so kind.
I think I can be pretty brief. I agree with everything Professor Wax said.
Thank you. Lee.
I pretty much agree with almost everything Professor Wax said. That was almost what my response was going to be. But, you know, we have a paper that was just accepted, finding that universities, this is not on implicit bias, although maybe it is in some way, some tangential, distant way. Universities that receive funding from authoritarian or Islamic countries or sources have detectably higher levels of erosion of liberal democratic norms around speech and academic freedom, and they have heightened levels of anti-Semitism. So I work with this freestanding institute that studies sort of radicalization and sort of threats to the functioning of a civil society. And they have actually been in touch with a Democratic congressman who I have heard, again, I can't, you know, this isn't, there's no bill yet, is interested in proposing to Congress. I hope this is true. Again, maybe this is apocryphal, maybe it was true, but it'll never happen. Well, it is wants to introduce a bill to Congress prohibiting colleges from receiving funds from either authoritarian regimes or regimes that are known for their support for terrorism. So, you know, I think, what do I think? I think it's absolutely true that the Democrats are unlikely to do anything to roll back the corrosive effects of everything related to DEI, which includes implicit bias trainings. Whereas the Republicans, especially when they control state governments, are much more likely to do that. I do think that that's true. And I do think, I mean, if for the, well, really for everybody here, the New York Times had this, just I think yesterday, came out with this great expose. It's very long, it's well worth the read, but this expose of the dysfunctions of DEI at the University of Michigan. And one can only hope, although again, I agree with Amy this far, the hope there would be on the Republican side, not on the Democrat side, that DEI, as it's practiced at elite universities, especially coastal universities, is either dramatically reformed or dramatically walked back. And that has been a source of a lot of this nonsense.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but these universities, maybe not the state ones, they might offer some hope. The private universities are a law unto themselves, okay?
Yeah.
They know that they are untouchable. The General Counsel's Office at Penn told my lawyer about a year ago, we don't care what we're revealed to be hypocrites, to contradict ourselves, we're revealed to be fools, we don't care, because as long as the money rolls in and the students apply, we're good. Nothing else matters.
I will mention that this is verging into some of the NAS's other territory. I will mention we have, for example, a whole bunch of policy on trying to get, tighter laws on transparency about gifts from foreign regimes. In effect, what Lee mentioned as a sort of, try to cut off all the money, we're trying to propose laws for everything up to there as well. So in fact, look, the art of the possible. If you can't get all the way to point Z, at least offer A, B, and C as well. And so I recommend watchers, listeners to look at our various policy work on this. It is terribly important to scrutinize the effects of foreign money and indeed, actually, and then also foreign students who are let in to provide tuition revenues for the universities and who then, engage in intimidating rioting, let us say, to put it very delicately, which is, not good all in all. And then just for the entire thing about how to reform everything. Yeah, this is NAS Central, and I won't get too much into that here, but um,
But
a
federal
great,
funding is the lifeblood here. Federal
yeah.
funding. We have nurses and truck drivers paying taxes so that Harvard and Yale can snorkel at the trough of the federal government. And that is what is happening in our country right now.
Let
Yeah.
me jump in on that one. I've worked in industry for a long time, and industry, because they have products to sell that actually have to work, is much less subject to the problems that we're seeing here. I've done a lot of work on reproducibility, and reproducibility from university research in many, many areas is incredibly bad. None of those researchers in universities would survive 6 months under industrial scrutiny. Cut off the money, just cut off the money.
I am for this, but I also want to get to the closing statements from Warren and Stanley before I get to this myself. In effect, amen. This is stuff NAS is, it's centrally what we're working for. Just want to say that. But I do want to get to Warren and Stanley for their closing statements also.
Okay, so maybe I'll go first, Stan. I'll let you finish up. I just wanted to put a plug in for the methods we've been using, the p-value plots. We've looked at them in a variety of scientific disciplines, including the social sciences, and we are able to see the same types of things, those types of published studies which do not reproduce, and those which actually do reproduce. So I think it's a promising method going forward. Stan?
Yes, I will put in a plug for simple counting. I can remember before the first grade, I was taught how to count 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. If you pick up a scientific paper and carefully scrutinize it as to how many questions are under consideration, we've done that in lots of areas. We have 70 papers that we've carefully gone through and counted. The median number of questions at issue in these papers was 13,000. Yes, it is absolutely shocking. So if you can't find a p-value less than 0.05 when you have 13,000 shots on goal, and that's true in environmental, it's true in nutrition, it's true at the CDC, and it's true right here. And I invented, with a friend, techniques for dealing with multiple testing. In 1993, I looked at various disciplines to see, my book is cited 13,000 times. No, sorry, 6,000 times or so. It is not cited in many disciplines at all. And those disciplines are the ones that are rampantly looking at multiple questions. So the p-value plot is very useful. It's a little technical. Simple counting, which I did in the first grade, is not very technical. And so anyone that wants to trash a particular paper, simply pick up the paper and count how many questions are at issue. And you'll get a counter paper right away. That's it.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to do the closing things, both as moderator and I suppose as writer. So first, thank you. Thank you to all my co-authors. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Needed all of you and audience, your questions you made for the question and answers. Thank you so much. I'm deeply grateful to everybody who's doing this. I just wanted to do for the technicalities that. Again, if you have leftover questions you want answered or come up with new ones, send them to me, randall@nas.org. I'll be delighted to forward your questions to any co-author or panelist. And then also, again, this is being recorded and it will be on the National Association of Scholars YouTube site within 24 hours. I just want to say a few things about, well, shifting sands as a whole. Uh, this is the fourth of 4 research projects, as I've said, and it's going to be followed up with a 5th policy-oriented conclusion, I think to be titled False Positives, and that ought to be coming out in 2025, which is in effect saying, here's everything we've learned, here are some things which should be done. So stay tuned for that. I want to mention that, all of this was funded by the Arthur N. Roop Foundation. 4 reports already, a 5th to come. We're deeply grateful to the Arthur N. Roop Foundation and particularly to Mark Henry for making this possible. Very big shout out and gratitude. And I guess I just want to get back to this whole social psychology thing. Here, I think perhaps even more than in our other reports, we were building upon an existing conversation of critique. 2 of our commenters here, Hal Arkes and Lee Jussim, have been working on this for years. We'd like to think that we're making a contribution, that we're adding to a conversation, but I really want to say that we're indebted to a lot of other people who've been doing really good work on this subject. We could not have done what we did without them. And gosh, if you like what we did, go back and look at the stuff everybody else did who's been doing good work on this. So this is the thank you, not just to everybody here, but to everybody doing good stuff in the field for the last 20 years. All right, and I think that's where I would end. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.